JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is one of the most legendary mangas ever made. Created by an immortal vampire some 36 years ago, JoJo's is known for many things, such as its revolutionary power system, intriguing antagonists, and the Jo Schlong. Besides those, however, the most notable aspect of JoJo might be its sense of style. Every era of JoJo's is a product of its time, whether that be with fashion, art style, or character designs. To give you an example, part 1 through 3 encompasses the tough guy persona, with muscular, charismatic, and stoic dudes drawn in the image of Fist of the North Star. Slowly but surely though, they started to become gay. The style became more bombastic, fluid, and cheerful, but to break this down, we will need to dive deep into the first half of the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure franchise, looking over part 1 through 3 to truly understand the artistic evolution of JoJo's. There are quite a few notable artistic decisions present in early JoJo's, such as its lean towards a simple style of the 1980s. Whilst the designs in part 2 and 3 were exceptional, the same can't really be said about Phantom Blood. The faces were simple, they weren't detailed, and everyone shared those 80s era design tropes, whether that be with the round eyes, soft features, or the nose. For me, it's kinda too much. The lack of detail makes these characters look like they have baby faces, and it doesn't really fit the whole, "Oh, my stepbro assaulted my girlfriend, then cooked my dog alive, and then took over my body after decapitating me." Holy shit, that out of context is way too bizarre. Despite all of this, however, there is still one issue here. Well, actually two. The anatomy and action scenes. We all know how absurd JoJo's anatomy was. We've all seen the memes. These muscular Rambo wannabes were just hunks of meat with massive bodies, arms as thick as tree trunks, and tiny heads. Just the exaggeration of anatomy isn't the issue, but rather Araki's morphage of anatomy. The limbs are just way too long, and in some panels, these poses actually break the laws of physics. You'd imagine that building such muscular long dudes will give you a nice foundation for action sequences, but for Araki it kinda didn't. Most action panels were flat and didn't really pack a punch, despite Araki using many techniques like speed lines and foreshortening to give these panels a bit more dynamicness. This kinda emphasizes the necessity of proper foundations. The baselines are pivotal, everything else is formalities. The reason why long limbs in theory make these panels more dynamic is because you can do a lot more with them without breaking the design. Toriyama, for example, aged up Goku because he couldn't really do much in terms of action. Goku had those stubby sausage limbs, so Toriyama always had to break his character to capture that 3D motion in space, which he loved so much. Toriyama always went for 3D motion in space whenever he could. That's why we get so many of these iconic panels, but Goku's design simply went against that. It made his life actually worse. To be fair with Phantom Blood though, sooner or later Araki started to give more energy and power to a lot of these panels, so it didn't really stay flat for long. Now for the shading. This is my favorite part of all of these videos, but Phantom Blood shading was practically non-existent. Grey tones and deep blacks were nearly devoid from the manga, which further contributed to the overall simplicity. Whilst yes, some panels had vague traces of dark shading, cross-hatching was by far the most dominant technique. Whilst it was scarce, compared to other mangas or compared to the later chapters in part 1, it was still there and it served to highlight features and even detail. Some kid is screaming in the background, it's annoying me. To get back on the faces for a sec, in Phantom Blood, expressions didn't really alter the features much. There were no wrinkles, no stretches, no nothing. Whenever we did get to see dynamic expressions, however, like later down in part 1, cross-hatching would come into play to give everything a little more grittiness. Despite what these color pages will tell you, the amount of tones you see here were not present in the original scans. I'm just using them so that you don't burn your retinas. I'm protecting your eyes, so you better subscribe and like. Before we move on to part 2, it needs to be mentioned again how part 1 drastically changed over its run. The previously mentioned shading became a larger part of the final product, along with the dynamic angles of the faces. They became more detailed, and all of that transitioned into battle tendency. As much as I want to talk about part 2's technical improvements, honestly, compared to late Phantom Blood, nothing really gets drastically improved. Nothing really gets overhauled, as many improvements within late Phantom Blood translate over. With that being said, however, there are some drastic drastic stylistic differences. First and foremost, the faces. Whilst the previous part's faces were more often than not simple, part 2 adds a lot more differentiating detail on all of these characters by improving the definition of the noses and, more importantly, improving the expressions. Every rage, every cry for help, every laughter has so much energy and dynamicness. It's kinda gut-wrenching at times, especially this scene. It just fits so much with the story now. The overall vibe is just correct almost. Before we move on to the drip, one more permanent stylistic change appears here, and that is the constant presence of line work and shading right around the nose. For some reason, Araki adds a lot of dark shading below the eyes, and this just never went away. It's found in part 1 and it's here even in part 9. Now as for the drip and designs, one word comes to mind when describing it. Gay, 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 gay. With all seriousness though, this is kind of the first stylistic evolution of JoJo's, as Araki implements various drastically different designs, whilst also playing with colors to make these amazing wallpaper-worthy illustrations. This marks the point where Araki starts to use some of his more trademark art styles, because previously it was kinda just, I don't know how to describe it, it's like imagining British food, but in the sense of style. It's shit, and you somehow know it's British. When I was going into this video, I had a thought of part 1, 3, and 4 being the main foundational shifts within the first half of JoJo, but with all honesty, part 3 is just not that different from part 2. And not to mention, most of the changes present in part 3 stay in part 3. We'll get into those later, but before that, the things that did improve is the impact of punches, which are now drastically more elevated, and along with that, these panels just have a lot more dynamicness as Araki starts to implement more 3D motion and spacing to convey various moments within the story. Honestly, the first ever panels really convey how far Araki has come in the last few years. Now as for the exclusive part 3 changes, firstly with the faces. They all have lines down their cheeks for some reason, like it's present nearly every single time, and despite it really adding a lot more volume and shape to these characters, it also contributes to making everything a lot more angular. Designs in this part are far more sharper and jagged, replacing the previous part's softer designs, but one more thing is still notable here, and that is the emergence of design tropes. Every single character that wears some form of a shirt has a single massive wrinkle horizontally right under their chest, highlighting their voluptuous pecs, I guess. Also, every single character's shoulder now is absolutely fucking massive, like it's almost a square shape. They look like American footballers. I don't know why, but this is completely and utterly toned down in later parts. You know, I was kinda lying when I said that there wasn't many revolutionary improvements in this part. There was one, and it had nothing to do with designs or specific techniques. Because Araki once again revolutionized his own manga by introducing one of the best power systems in all of manga, he had to improve his presentation to such a degree that he can actually stand toe-to-toe with that power system. In part 3, every single fight is a mystery. You do not know what your opponent's power is, and the whole point of these battles is finding out what your opponent can do. Araki's eye for detail and highlighting specific moments within these fights that convey information gets elevated to such an extent to the point where his overall paneling is far more superior than anything that came in the previous parts of JoJo. As much as I want to talk about part 4 and 5, I'm gonna save that for the next video. See ya in part 2!